Hi, I'm Christopher, and in this video, I'm uncovering the last recorded moments of people attacked by animals, from a family of 4 on a romantic safari float in Zambia, to a breeder fatally crushed by one of the world's longest snakes, which led to a devastating turn of event. It was September 3rd, 2014. The early morning mist lay thick over the surface of the lake, flattening the horizon into a pale, indistinct blur where water and sky blended into one. The air was cool and still, carrying that quiet, suspended feeling that comes just before sunrise, when sound travels farther and movement feels amplified against the silence. The shoreline, normally visible from even a moderate distance, had been reduced to faint, shifting outlines through the haze. Samuel Otieno was 36 years old. He had grown up near the lake and had been fishing its waters since he was a child, first alongside his father and later on his own. By his mid-30s, he had accumulated more than 2 decades of experience on the water, enough to know its moods, its currents, its seasonal patterns, and the behavior of the animals that shared it. That morning, Samuel was working a quiet section of the lake, setting nets along a stretch of bank he had fished many times. At some point during the work, he anchored briefly to untangle a section of net that had caught on itself. The anchor did not hold against the lake's slow, barely perceptible current. In the heavy mist, with no clear visual reference to the shoreline, the drift was not immediately apparent. By the time he had worked through the tangle and returned his attention to his position on the water, he had moved. He had drifted into a hippo transit route. I find that detail almost unbearable. He didn't make a wrong decision. He just drifted. Hippopotamuses are largely nocturnal in their grazing behavior. They leave the water at dusk, moving along established paths to graze on land through the night, and return along those same routes in the hours just before dawn. These transit paths are consistent and territorial. The animals use the same routes repeatedly, and they move along them with purpose and at speed, particularly in the final approach to the water as daylight begins to build. At approximately 5:22 a.m., as Samuel leaned over the side of the canoe to continue his work, the water beside him surged without warning. The hippo struck from below and to the side. The force of the impact drove into the wooden hull with enough violence to capsize it instantly and cave in one side. A wooden canoe of the type used by local fishermen on the lake is built for lightness and maneuverability, not for impact resistance. It did not split cleanly in two, but it did not need to. The strike was sufficient to destroy its structural integrity and throw Samuel clear in a single motion. He did not go over gradually. He was ejected. The animal resurfaced in the same area almost immediately. Hippopotamuses, once agitated by a disturbance in their territory or along their transit route, do not disengage immediately. They respond to continued surface movement and disturbance with repeated contact. A person in the water, generating movement and displacement, presents exactly the kind of stimulus that sustains that response. Nearby fishermen working other sections of the lake in the pre-dawn hours reported hearing a single shout. After that, silence. I've read a lot of these accounts, and somehow, that detail, one shout, then nothing, is always the hardest part. The mist and the distance between their positions meant none of them had a clear view of what had occurred. The sound carried across the still water and then stopped. His body was recovered later that morning along the shoreline, carried there by the lake's slow current over the hours between the incident and the recovery. The investigation that followed examined the circumstances of Samuel's death in detail. The combination of pre-dawn timing and heavy mist had reduced visibility to a level that made it effectively impossible to identify the presence of a hippo at any meaningful distance. The temporary anchor had failed to hold, and the drift it allowed had moved Samuel's canoe across a transit route that the hippo was actively using at the time. There was no indication from the available evidence that Samuel was aware of the animal's proximity before contact. The mist had removed any visual warning. The stillness of the water before the strike had removed any auditory warning. The animal had been moving through familiar territory, along a route it used regularly, and the canoe had drifted into its path. There were no third parties involved in the incident itself. The finding was accidental death. The investigation noted that the pre-dawn fishing hours, while standard practice among local fishermen on the lake, placed workers on the water during the period of highest hippo transit activity, and that the combination of low visibility conditions and the use of temporary anchors in unfamiliar drift conditions had contributed to the fatal outcome. It was October 3rd, 2013, in the Bob Marshall Wilderness of Montana. Elevation at this location was 6,400 feet. and the first significant snowfall of the season was forecast to arrive within 48 hours. The terrain was steep, with the hunting area situated on a north-facing slope that dropped 800 feet over a half-mile. Reed Matheson was 32 years old, a licensed hunting outfitter who had operated in the Bob Marshall Wilderness for 9 years. He had grown up in Montana, learned to hunt from his father, and established his guiding business after working for other outfitters for 5 seasons. Reed was experienced in grizzly country and had encountered bears numerous times, including 3 previous instances where he had successfully backed away without incident, and one occasion where he had fired warning shots to deter a persistent bear near a gut pile. Reed was guiding a client from Texas on a bow hunt for elk. They had been in the wilderness for 4 days, camping at a base location and hiking out each day to hunt different areas. That morning, they had left camp early and hiked 2 miles to a ridge where elk had been bugling the previous evening. The client was 200 yards behind Reed, moving slowly and quietly through the timber. Reed carried a rifle on all hunts, considered adequate for both elk and bear defense. In 2013, bear spray was becoming more common among outfitters, but many experienced Montana guides, Reed included, relied primarily on firearms and situational awareness. The area was prime elk habitat during the rut, and also prime grizzly habitat. Bears in this region were in hyperphagia, the pre-hibernation feeding frenzy, actively seeking high-calorie food sources. Elk carcasses were particularly attractive. The Northern Continental Divide ecosystem grizzly population is one of the largest in the lower 48 states, with adult males typically weighing between 400 and 700 pounds, some exceeding 800 pounds. Grizzly bears will claim and defend food sources aggressively, particularly large carcasses. Once a bear has established a cache, it will remain nearby and defend the food against all threats. A bear on a carcass is often bedded within 50 feet of the kill and may not be visible until a person is dangerously close. The response to an intruder is immediate and violent, with no warning signs or bluff charges. That morning, Reed was moving slowly through a section of forest where trees grew close together, and deadfall created obstacles every few yards. He paused frequently to listen for elk. Reed stepped over a fallen log and immediately smelled something strong and unpleasant. The odor was organic, like rotting meat mixed with a musky animal smell. He stopped and scanned ahead. The elk carcass was 40 feet directly in front of him, partially hidden behind a cluster of small fir trees. It was a cow elk, dead for at least 2 days, based on the smell and condition. She was lying on her side, with the ribcage exposed, opened and fed upon, the internal organs removed. Reed recognized immediately that a bear had claimed the carcass. He began backing away slowly, keeping his eyes forward. His rifle was in his hands at a low ready position. The grizzly stood up from its bed 25 feet to Reed's right, slightly behind his position. The bear had been lying in a depression behind a fallen log, completely invisible until it rose. It was a large male with dark brown fur and a massive head. Its ears were flat against its skull. Reed turned and saw the bear. He did not have time to raise his rifle and acquire a sight picture. The bear charged immediately, covering the distance in less than 2 seconds. The bear struck Reed from the side with both front paws, knocking him off his feet. He landed on his left side, and the rifle fell from his hands. The bear bit his right shoulder, jaws closing around the shoulder joint and upper arm, crushing bone and tearing through muscle. Reed shouted, a loud yell that carried through the forest. The bear released and bit his back, teeth penetrating deep between his shoulder blades, causing catastrophic damage. Reed's legs stopped responding. The bear bit again, catching the back of Reed's neck. The canine teeth drove through muscle and into bone, causing massive trauma. When the bear released, Reed was no longer moving or making sound. The bear stood over him briefly, then returned to the elk carcass and resumed feeding. Reed's client heard the shout and moved quickly toward the sound. He reached the position minutes later, saw the bear on the carcass, and backed away quietly before returning to camp to call for help via satellite phone. A helicopter was dispatched, but could not land due to terrain and tree cover. A ground team reached the location that afternoon and found Reed's body 43 feet from the elk carcass, lying face down in the forest duff. The grizzly was still present on the carcass and had to be hazed away with gunfire before the team could approach. The cause of death was massive trauma to the upper back and neck with severe hemorrhaging and crushing injuries to vital structures. The bear had not fed on Reed's body and showed no interest in him after the attack. His rifle was found 11 feet away, unfired. The case was ruled an accidental death resulting from a surprise encounter with a bear defending a carcass. It was March 28, 2015, in a cocoa plantation in the eastern region of Ghana, where thick vegetation covered the ground after days of heavy rain. The narrow paths between plots were muddy, and visibility near the ground was poor. The ground looks almost the same everywhere. Wet leaves, dark soil, nothing really stands out. Kojo Mensah, 42, worked seasonally on the plantation. He was known for being efficient, often moving faster than others, by cutting through areas most workers avoided. He had done the job long enough to feel comfortable navigating dense brush, even when others stuck to the cleared paths. You can picture him moving ahead of the others, not really slowing down, just focused on getting through. That week, supervisors had warned workers to stay on marked paths. The rain had pushed animals, including snakes, into thicker ground cover. Most workers followed the advice, but Kojo continued using a shortcut he had taken many times before. Late in the morning, he moved between plots, stepping through leaf litter and low brush. The ground was uneven, softened by rain, and covered in fallen leaves. Visibility was limited to just a few feet ahead. Everything is quiet except for footsteps and the sound of leaves shifting under him. He stepped forward. His foot came down directly onto a camouflaged Gaboon viper. The snake struck immediately. Kojo jerked back, more surprised than anything at first. For a brief moment, it wasn't clear what had happened. Then, the pain hit, sharp and immediate. He tried to steady himself, but the intensity forced him to stop moving. The reaction is quick, more instinct than understanding at that point. Within moments, swelling began around his ankle. The area around the bite changed quickly, and he struggled to put weight on it. He called out, and nearby workers rushed over. They found him sitting on the ground, trying to stay upright. The swelling was already spreading and bleeding from the wound hadn't stopped. You can imagine them looking down, trying to figure out what exactly they're dealing with. Co-workers tried to help him stand, but he couldn't support himself. They decided to carry him out of the brush toward the nearest access road. One of them ran ahead to alert the supervisor. As they moved him, his condition started to change. He became weaker, less responsive. His grip loosened when they tried to support him. He spoke less, and when he did, it was unclear. The movement gets slower, more careful, like they're trying not to make things worse. They tried to keep his legs still, but the uneven ground made it difficult, and the walk to the main road felt longer than usual. A vehicle was arranged quickly, but the 40-minute ride to the clinic proved critical. During transport, his condition worsened. Swelling spread up his leg, bleeding continued, and the venom disrupted clotting, causing internal bleeding and a sharp drop in blood pressure, reducing oxygen to his organs. By the time they arrived, he was in critical condition with hypovolemic shock and systemic envenomation. Despite anti-venom and fluids, his condition worsened with ongoing tissue damage, internal bleeding, and falling blood pressure. Over the next few hours, he developed organ failure and later died from massive hemotoxic effects due to circulatory collapse and uncontrolled internal bleeding. The incident didn't spread far beyond the plantation. It was recorded internally and briefly noted in local reports, but it didn't gain wider attention. Among workers, though, it changed how people moved through the fields. After something like that, the same paths don't feel the same anymore. In the following weeks, supervisors reinforced rules about staying on cleared paths. Workers who once took shortcuts began avoiding dense brush altogether. Kojo was remembered as someone hardworking and experienced, someone who knew the land well. It's the kind of place where people just go back to work the next day, but a little more careful than before. Looking at the situation, I think it could have been avoided. The safer path was already there, and the conditions that day made things riskier than usual. I don't think he expected anything to happen. It probably felt like any other day, but in places like that, one step in the wrong spot is all it takes. It was April 8th, 2015, along the banks of the Zambezi River in Lower Zambezi National Park, Zambia, where a wide sandy bank sloped quietly into slow-moving brown water. Just meters from shore, beneath a still inlet partially covered in reeds and algae, something large remained hidden. Hank Barsaga, 52, a semi-retired tobacco farmer from Chinhoyi, Zimbabwe, led a solitary, physically demanding life. Over 6 feet tall and heavily built, he spent most days repairing engines or tending a small garden. Twice divorced and rarely in contact with his adult children, he carried a quiet confidence from years of hands-on work. The canoe safari, arranged by his brother Fanis to reconnect, appealed to Hank, who felt at ease in the river and believed he understood its risks. The early part of the safari went by without incident. The group paddled downstream, camping on riverbanks and islands, observing wildlife from a distance. Their guide, Chisulobanda, 41, repeated the same rules each morning. Stay away from the water's edge, never crouch near the bank, and avoid direct contact with the river. I saw these weren't just casual suggestions, they came from years of fatal incidents, where one wrong step had cost someone their life. Hank acknowledged the instructions, but showed little concern, noting that crocodiles were slow and almost indifferent. The lunch stop appeared safe at first glance. The bank was open, slightly elevated, and offered clear visibility. No tracks or disturbances suggested recent animal activity, yet a narrow inlet branched inward, the water darker and still, partially obscured by reeds and algae. Field studies consistently identify these quiet inlets as high-risk zones. Still water allows crocodiles to remain hidden at extremely close range. After eating, Hank approached the water. His hands were greasy from handling fish, and he ignored the suggestion to use a bottle. He moved to the edge, lowered himself onto one knee, and leaned forward, placing both hands into the river just below the surface. The crocodile had already detected him. Hidden less than 5 meters away, it remained submerged, eyes and nostrils barely above water. The movement of Hank's hands was enough to trigger the predator. I've seen situations like this in my research, and it's striking how quickly a hidden threat can react to the smallest movement. The strike came instantly. The surface erupted. The crocodile lunged forward. Hank reacted too late. His right hand escaped, but his left arm was caught as the jaws closed. The force crushed bone instantly and pulled him forward. He screamed, struggling, fingers clawing into the wet sand, but the crocodile shifted its grip higher, securing him across the chest and abdomen. His leverage disappeared. Within moments, he was pulled fully into the river. The attack lasted only seconds. The water churned violently as the crocodile spun, maintaining its hold. A single glimpse of Hank's arm appeared above the surface before disappearing. Then, the river returned to calm. It's terrifying to realize how quickly a calm moment can turn deadly. There's almost no time to react once the predator strikes. Fanis reached the bank, but was pulled back. The guide secured the group and called for emergency help, knowing that attempting to enter the water would only risk more lives. By the time a response team arrived over an hour later, the river yielded no sign of him. Hank's remains were recovered the next morning downstream, lodged beneath submerged roots, and confirmed through dental records and a tattoo. The incident was classified as a wildlife-related fatality. The crocodile was not pursued. The area was reassessed, and operators were instructed to avoid riverbanks near inlets or dense vegetation. This outcome highlights the razor-thin margin for safety in such environments. Even small actions, kneeling at the edge, placing hands in the water, ignoring a guide's instruction, can eliminate that margin entirely. From what I've seen, staying back from the water and following the guide's instructions is the only way to feel truly safe. Once a crocodile is underwater, there's almost no way to spot it before it strikes. Hank's body was returned to Zimbabwe. There was no widespread media coverage and no extended investigation beyond standard procedures. What remains is the stark reminder that ordinary, seemingly minor choices can align in seconds to create a fatal outcome, even for someone familiar with the environment. It was June 5th, 2016, and cold winter wind moved through the hills outside Mukanduli. The night came early, and the air carried a quiet tension that locals had started to notice. For weeks, a pack of hyenas had been moving closer to homes along Mabane Road, drawn by the scarcity of wild prey and the proximity of human settlements. Nombeko Tayalela, 74, lived alone in a small cement block house. She had spent most of her life working as a domestic helper in East London before returning home after a mild stroke. The stroke left her with a limp, and she relied on a wooden cane for support. Her house had 2 small rooms and a kitchen. Over the years, the front door had warped, and the rusted slide bolt no longer secured it properly. She followed a quiet routine, tending her small garden and living off her pension. Her nephew, Andil, 19, lived about 600 meters away and visited when he could, usually bringing food. Most nights, she remained alone. I keep thinking about how being alone can make situations more dangerous without you realizing it, especially when small changes in the environment start adding up. In the days leading up to June 5th, Warning signs were evident. Nombeko noticed deep scratches near the front door. Neighbors reported seeing hyenas near the area, sometimes in the evening, moving confidently as they tested the boundaries between forest and settlement. Spotted hyenas are among Africa's most adaptable predators, capable of both hunting and scavenging depending on opportunity. What makes them especially dangerous near human settlements is their intelligence and persistence. They learn patterns quickly, remember locations of food sources, and will repeatedly test weak structures or entry points if they've been rewarded before. In areas where natural prey becomes scarce, spotted hyenas are known to move closer to villages, drawn by livestock, waste, and food odors, sometimes becoming bold enough to enter poorly secured homes at night. During his last visit, Andile saw the door's poor condition but did not repair it. That evening, Nombeko prepared maize porridge and beef stew. The aroma spread through the house and drifted into the cold night air. After finishing her meal, she left the pot in the kitchen and went to bed. She secured the door as best she could, but the rusted bolt only partially caught, leaving a small gap. Combined with the lingering smell of food and scattered scraps outside, the gap became an open invitation for the hyenas. They approached cautiously at first, nudging and pushing against the door to test its strength. When the weakened bolt finally gave way, they forced their way inside. A pack of 3 hyenas reached the house soon after. The scent of maize porridge and beef stew had carried outside, mixing with traces of prior scavenging near the door. The partially latched bolt provided just enough space for the underfed hyenas to push through. Their entry was opportunistic, not deliberate. The house simply offered an easy source of food. From similar cases I've studied, once predators detect a weak point, the danger escalates quickly, as they repeatedly exploit the opening until they succeed. With hyenas, the intensity of such encounters is heightened. Few people expect a wild predator to enter a home, and the combination of scent, food scraps, and a weak barrier can turn a quiet night into a deadly situation. The hyenas pushed harder, testing the door until it finally gave way entirely. Once inside, they surged into the kitchen, scattering food and knocking over pots, creating chaos as they moved through the confined space. The noise woke Nombeko. Thinking someone had broken in, she rose slowly with her cane and shuffled toward the commotion. As she opened her bedroom door, she came face to face with the hyenas in the narrow hallway linking the rooms. The confined space left almost no room to move. One hyena lunged, striking her arm. She crashed onto the concrete floor, her cane skidding out of reach. The rest of the pack followed immediately, their snarls and heavy footsteps filling the small space. She tried to defend herself, but her limited mobility in the narrow hallway left her trapped. The hyenas, agitated by the confined space and the smell of food, knocked over pots and scattered scraps. The danger wasn't deliberate. It was the predictable result of predators exploiting an easy opportunity. After some time, the activity slowed. The hyenas remained in the kitchen area, moving through the space where food had been. Nombeko was discovered that morning by her nephew, Andile, who noticed the damaged door and interior in disarray. Alarmed, he immediately called police and wildlife officers, who arrived within hours and confirmed the fatal attack. The incident was classified as a fatal wildlife encounter, with the hyenas acting within normal predatory behavior. Over the following week, authorities captured 2 of the 3 hyenas, relocating them to a protected reserve, while the remaining 2 were never found. Nombeko was buried in a small funeral attended by about 40 people. Andile later returned to care for the property, replacing the broken door with a steel gate and avoiding overnight stays in the house for some time. Looking at this case, it wasn't a single mistake that led to her death. It was the buildup, the damaged door, repeated warning signs, and isolation all stacked over time. It was September 18th, 2018, in backcountry terrain near Glacier National Park, Montana. Early morning. The light was low and the air was cold. The ground was a mix of open meadow and dense forest, the kind of terrain that changes quickly between clear sightlines and thick cover. The park and surrounding land carry one of the highest grizzly densities in the contiguous United States. Larry Bennett, 29, was from Missoula and had spent multiple seasons traveling alone through backcountry wilderness in the region. He documented his trips on a vlog with approximately 7,200 followers. His content was grounded and detailed. Trail conditions, navigation, wildlife sightings at a distance. He knew the terrain and moved through it with confidence built over years of solo travel. That experience was real. It shaped how he read situations and how much he trusted his own judgment when the signs were not obvious. And look, I want to be honest here. If you watch his earlier content before the subseries, it is genuinely good, careful, detailed, respectful of the environment. This was not always a reckless channel. That makes what came next harder to watch. Over time, his content shifted. He began a subseries he called The Long Approach. The premise was simple. Locate a specific wild animal across multiple days and film it at progressively closer range. The subject he chose was a grizzly sow with 2 yearling cubs. He found her in the same general area across several outings and began tracking her movements, returning each day to film from a shorter distance than the day before. And this is where it starts to get deeply uncomfortable. Because the subseries had a name, he had planned it. Over 11 days, the distance closed from approximately 300 yards to 60 yards. Each session was filmed and uploaded. Each one showed him a little closer than the last. He narrated this progress as evidence that the animal was becoming accustomed to his presence, that the lack of a charge meant acceptance, that tolerance and habituation were the same thing. They are not. A grizzly that does not charge is not a grizzly that has accepted a human. A sow with yearling cubs operates under a different set of pressures than a solitary bear. She is not assessing whether a nearby human is a threat to herself alone. She is assessing whether it is a threat to her cubs. I actually spent 3 hours going through wildlife research specifically on sow behavior for this case, and what I found is that a sow with cubs does not give you signals the way a solitary bear does. She waits, and then she does not. Larry had been watching the same bear for 11 days and had not been charged. That history became the basis of his confidence. Because nothing had happened yet, he treated it as evidence that nothing would happen. This is a common and dangerous pattern. Each time he closed distance, he moved the threshold closer to where he was standing. What gets me about that logic is how completely reasonable it sounds from the inside. 11 days, no charge. Of course he felt safe. The bear had never given him a reason not to. On the 12th day, he returned to the same area and closed the distance further. At approximately 40 yards, he was still filming. The sow was present with her cubs. At 40 yards, a grizzly bear covers the distance to a human in under 3 seconds. There is no time to deploy bear spray at that range if the charge has already begun. There is no safe direction to move. The terrain at that distance does not offer cover. That means anything against an animal of that speed and weight. And this is the moment everything that had been building for 11 days came to its conclusion. The sow charged. The initial impact was from the full force of the animal's body weight moving at speed. The contact that followed included biting and clawing, consistent with a defensive encounter, not a predatory one. A defensive grizzly attack is not an attempt to kill and consume. It is an attempt to neutralize a perceived threat. The animal attacks until it determines the threat is gone, then disengages. The injuries produced in that time are severe, regardless of the animal's intent. The duration was brief. When the bear disengaged, Larry was on the ground. He was alive. He attempted to move and covered approximately 200 meters from the point of contact before he could not continue. Search teams were deployed after he failed to return and could not be contacted. He was located in backcountry terrain several hours later, approximately 200 meters from the point of initial contact. Responders reached him on foot and initiated assessment, but he was unresponsive with no detectable pulse. Due to the extent of blood loss and the time elapsed, resuscitation was not possible. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Clinical assessment determined the cause of death to be exsanguination, resulting from traumatic injuries sustained in a grizzly bear attack. Wildlife officials investigated the area and confirmed the presence of a sow with cubs. The attack was classified as defensive behavior. The bear was not euthanized, as no ongoing threat to the public was identified. The area was temporarily closed as a precaution. Larry's scheduled content was taken offline, and his family held a service in Missoula. And the part that stays with me about Larry Bennett, the detail I cannot move past, is that scheduled video going live while he was dying out there. His audience was watching old footage of him getting closer to that bear while he was already gone. That is the part that keeps me up. It was November 11th, 2013, and the Arizona desert outside Yuma was doing what it rarely gets credit for, being cold. Not the sharp cold of northern winters, but the dry, biting chill that settles into desert air after dark. The kind that catches people off guard because they associate the landscape with heat. The morning had started clear and still, the kind of quiet that makes a property feel more isolated than it actually is. Leonard Pike, 61, was retired, and the compound behind his residence had become the primary project of his later years. He'd spent decades working before stepping back, and the animals, particularly the Bengal tiger he'd acquired several years prior, had given his days structure and purpose. Arizona was, and remains, one of the more permissive states in the country regarding exotic animal ownership. Private big cat ownership was legal with limited oversight. Enclosure standards varied widely by county, and the regulatory framework leaned heavily on self-reporting. Leonard had his paperwork in order. He operated within the law as it existed. That's an important detail, because it means the failure here wasn't legal, it was structural, and it had been visible for some time. Bengal tigers are not animals that test boundaries occasionally. They test them constantly, methodically, and with a patience that outlasts most owners' attention spans. In captivity, they pace fence lines, probe weak points, and apply pressure to structures repeatedly over time, not out of distress necessarily, but because movement and investigation are hardwired into their behavior. A tiger that has identified a weak point in its enclosure will return to it. Wildlife containment specialists note that ground-level vulnerabilities are among the most common failure points in private enclosures, because erosion and soil shift happen gradually and are easy to underestimate until the gap is already significant. The steel holds, the ground beneath it moves, and the animal notices before the owner does. Leonard's enclosure was a 35 by 50-foot steel structure anchored into concrete footings, substantial by most private standards. But along the base of the fence line, soil erosion and minor burrowing had created weak points. Over time, gaps where the ground had shifted away from the steel. Leonard had observed them. Partial repairs had been made. The gaps had not been fully closed. Containment standards for large predators are explicit. Reinforced ground barriers and double gate entry systems are not optional features. They are the difference between a secure enclosure and one that is waiting for the right amount of pressure. I think about how many times Leonard must have walked past those weak points and told himself he'd get to it properly. I've done the same thing with far less consequential problems, and I still feel uneasy about it. On the morning of November 11th, Leonard approached the enclosure carrying approximately 12 pounds of raw meat for the morning feeding. What he didn't know, couldn't have known from the approach path, was that the tiger had already found the weakened section at the base of the fence line. The animal had forced through the gap, widening it, and exited the enclosure before Leonard reached the gate. Tracks in disturbed soil indicated the tiger had moved freely beyond the enclosure perimeter before the attack occurred. The encounter happened outside, in open ground, within a short distance of the breach point. There was nothing between Leonard and the animal. A nearby resident reported a brief disturbance, then silence. Leonard was found later that afternoon, after failing to return inside the residence. Authorities located the tiger near the property and euthanized it due to immediate risk. Inspection confirmed structural failure along the fence base, consistent with erosion and sustained pressure from the animal over time. The incident prompted a local review of private exotic animal containment standards in the region. What separates Leonard's case from every other story in this collection is geography. Every other incident happened inside an enclosure, in a space that was, at least in theory, designed to contain the risk. Leonard's happened outside, in open ground, because the boundary he had relied on had already failed before he arrived. The enclosure didn't hold, and by the time he reached the gate, the situation had already moved beyond it. It was September 15, 2017, and the Western Ghats had been under monsoon rains. For weeks, the forest floor turned to dark, compressed leaf rot, the canopy holding water long after the clouds moved through. The kind of terrain where the distance between something hidden and something visible is almost nothing. Arjun Pillai, 52, from the Palakka district of Kerala, had spent nearly 2 decades operating at the edges of the wildlife trade. His wife had died years earlier. His 2 older children had moved away. Neighbors described him as quiet and rarely employed in any legitimate sense. What sustained him financially was a network of brokers who paid well for live reptiles, juvenile king cobras in particular, which moved easily through underground markets in Southeast Asia. He had made this kind of trip dozens of times and returned without incident, and I think that record had long since hardened into something resembling certainty. He brought his son, Kavi, 16, likely for practicality. The boy was quiet, could carry collection bags, and knew not to ask unnecessary questions. Kavi had accompanied him on 2 prior trips without protest. This morning he protested. He said the undergrowth near the nest looked disturbed. He said they should turn back. Arjun did not respond. The forest in the Western Ghat during late monsoon is dense enough to conceal anything at ground level. King cobras are the longest venomous snakes in the world, capable of exceeding 10 to 12 feet. Unlike nearly all other species, they construct nests and actively guard them. A nest-guarding adult will not retreat. The venom is potent, capable of causing severe neurotoxic paralysis in humans. In untreated adult humans, death can occur, but documented fatalities generally develop over 1 to several hours. Forest Department rangers had circulated informal warnings to nearby villages the prior week following a confirmed sighting in the same buffer zone. A retired forest watcher who knew Arjun had told him directly that the area was active and that 2 local men had already abandoned the trail. Arjun apparently nodded and said nothing. That morning, less than 20 yards from the nest site, Kavi spotted a shed skin caught in the lower brush, nearly translucent, intact, longer than either of them. He stopped. Arjun stepped over it and kept moving. At the nest, a compressed mound of decaying vegetation pressed against a granite outcrop. Arjun crouched and peered into the undergrowth. He told Kavi to hold the bag open. He reached his right arm into the brush. Now I know he's been in this trade for a long time, but reaching an arm into a snake's den? Has he just been lucky until this moment? The cobra raised its hood and made a brief hissing display before striking. It struck across the forearm just below the elbow. The impact was audible. He recoiled briefly, but then grabbed the snake, likely in a panicked attempt to control it. It struck 2 more times, once on the right index finger, once across the palm. He swung his machete, repeatedly, eventually severing the snake in sections. The detached head lay in the leaf litter, jaw moving reflexively. Kavi said that he was stunned, unsure how to react, because this is the first time this ever happened. At first, they started hauling the eggs to the bag, but within minutes, swelling tracked visibly up the forearm toward the elbow. Arjun lowered himself to the ground. Kavi stood watching his father. Then he ran. He sprinted nearly 2 miles through wet, uneven terrain to the nearest paved road and flagged down a passing truck, which drove him to the village. Villagers reached the nest site approximately 1 to 1.5 hours after the first strike. Arjun was supine and unresponsive. The severed snake, the machete, and 3 visible bite sites on his right arm and hand established the sequence of events. He later died at the village clinic. Cause of death was severe neurotoxic envenomation, leading to acute respiratory failure, consistent with king cobra. Multiple bite wounds on the right forearm, right index finger, and right palm. Arjun was buried without a formal service. The Forest Department filed an incident report noting the poaching equipment recovered at the scene: collection bags, a wire snare, and 2 plastic transport containers. With the offender deceased, no charges were pursued. Kavi Pillai was taken in by his maternal uncle in Coimbatore. A welfare program affiliated with the Kerala Forest Department helped cover his schooling costs. He sat his secondary exams in 2019, passed, and enrolled that autumn in an electrical trades program at a polytechnic college in Thrissur. I think that if his father was still alive, Kavi wouldn't be given this opportunity. It was March 4th, 2016, when the desert heat shimmered over Daniel Ortiz's property in rural Arizona, just outside Tucson. The 5-acre compound featured several large outbuildings, housing Daniel's extensive reptile collection, everything from rattlesnakes to monitor lizards. But the crown jewel was a 10-year-old Komodo dragon named Titan, housed in a custom-built habitat that took up half of the largest building on the property. Daniel, 38, was a self-taught herpetologist who had spent 15 years building his reputation in the exotic reptile community. He ran a small but successful breeding operation, selling high-end reptiles to private collectors and occasionally consulting for small zoos. His expertise was widely respected, but those who knew him also knew he had a dangerous habit. He took unnecessary risks to save time during routine maintenance. Daniel had acquired Titan 8 years earlier through a complex process involving federal exotic animal permits, CITES clearance, and a transfer arrangement with a licensed zoological facility in Florida. Titan was just 2 feet long at the time, but had since grown to 8 feet and weighed approximately 180 pounds. Daniel hand-fed Titan weekly and had developed what he believed was a mutual respect with the massive lizard. The habitat was a 30 by 20 foot enclosure with concrete floors, heated rocks, and a shallow pool. Every 2 weeks, Daniel entered to deep clean, while Titan was fed in a separate holding area. However, Daniel had recently started taking shortcuts, cleaning while Titan was still in the main habitat to save the 30 minutes it took to move the dragon. On the afternoon of March 4th, Daniel began his routine cleaning. Titan rested near the heated rocks, seemingly uninterested in Daniel's activities. About 20 minutes in, Daniel reached to adjust a heat lamp and accidentally sliced his left hand on a sharp edge of the metal fixture. The cut was minor, maybe an inch long across his palm, but it bled freely. Daniel cursed under his breath and reached for a rag, not immediately noticing that Titan's head had lifted and his forked tongue was flicking rapidly in the air. Komodo dragons are the world's largest living lizards. Adult males can exceed 10 feet in length and weigh over 200 pounds, with powerful jaws bearing between 50 and 60 serrated teeth designed to tear flesh. They possess venom glands in their lower jaw that secrete anticoagulant and hypotensive compounds, substances that impair clotting and contribute to shock, compounding the already severe mechanical trauma of a bite. Highly sensitive to scent, Komodo dragons can detect blood from considerable distances using their Jacobson's organ, and fresh blood triggers their predatory response with near immediacy. Titan slowly raised his massive body from the heated rock, eyes locking onto Daniel's bleeding hand. Daniel noticed and began backing toward the enclosure door, maintaining eye contact and speaking in what he hoped was a calm tone. But Titan was already committed. The 180-pound lizard moved with surprising speed, closing the 12 feet between them in less than 3 seconds. Daniel turned to run, but his foot caught on the drain grate, and he stumbled. Titan's jaws clamped down on Daniel's left forearm, just above the wrist. The serrated teeth drove deep into muscle and tendon, and the dragon's neck muscles thrashed side to side in the signature killing motion that tears massive chunks of flesh from prey. Multiple blood vessels were torn open simultaneously, including both the radial and ulnar arteries, producing hemorrhage that could not be controlled by pressure alone. The venom compounds would further impair clotting over the following minutes, but it was the sheer physical destruction of the bite that made the wound immediately life-threatening. Even as Daniel pressed his right hand hard against the torn flesh, blood surged through his fingers in steady, unstoppable pulses. Titan released his grip after approximately 15 seconds and stepped back. Functioning on pure adrenaline, Daniel scrambled toward the exit and got through the door, slamming it shut behind him. He stumbled toward his truck, pressing his right hand against the wound with as much force as he could manage. The pressure slowed the bleeding, but could not stop it. Without a tourniquet, the damage to multiple vessels was simply too extensive. Daniel collapsed next to his truck and managed to dial 911, gasping out his address before the phone slipped from his fingers. He lost consciousness approximately 8 minutes after the initial bite. Without a tourniquet in place, the hemorrhage continued unchecked. Emergency responders arrived 17 minutes after the 911 call and found Daniel unconscious in a large pool of blood. Paramedics applied a tourniquet and initiated IV fluids, but Daniel had already lost a dangerous proportion of his blood volume. He was airlifted to a trauma center in Tucson, where surgeons worked to repair the extensive vascular damage. The surgery stabilized him temporarily, but the hemorrhagic shock had taken a severe toll. His organs began to fail despite transfusions and interventions. Daniel never regained consciousness and died 18 hours after the attack from multi-organ failure. Wildlife authorities seized Titan and Daniel's entire reptile collection. The Komodo dragon was quarantined before being transferred back to the zoological facility that had originally provided him. Arizona tightened its regulations on dangerous exotic species in the aftermath. It was the late afternoon of August 6, 2013, in a private game reserve in the Limpopo province of South Africa, where the bush was dry and the grass had turned yellow from months without rain. Near the reserve's northern boundary, a small group of spotted hyenas had been feeding on a carcass since midday. Animals move differently when water is scarce. Johan van Rensburg, 44, was a South African safari guide with over 15 years of experience in the Limpopo bushveld. Widely respected among colleagues, he had guided hundreds of clients through the same terrain without incident. That familiarity had also produced a quiet confidence in his own judgment, a belief that he could read a situation accurately enough to act where others would not. I think this is one of the most dangerous places a person in the field can end up. Not ignorance, but the kind of experience that starts to feel like immunity. Understanding how animals behave from a vehicle, or with clients, or in the dozens of situations that resolved without incident is not the same as being on foot, alone, at a feeding site with no deterrent and no backup. Johan received a report that hyenas had been active near the northern fence line with signs of a fresh kill. He decided to investigate on foot, alone. Before nightfall, he told a colleague he would be back within the hour. That detail, telling someone he would be back within the hour, suggests he understood there was some level of risk involved. He simply believed that his experience was sufficient to manage it. That belief was the error. Spotted hyenas are highly social and intelligent animals, and their behavior around an active kill is something I think most people, even experienced guides, underestimate. A clan at a feeding site is in a state of heightened arousal, competitive and territorial, with a bite force exceeding 1,000 pounds per square inch, enough to crush the femur of a large ungulate cleanly. What makes them particularly dangerous in a group is not just their physical capability, but their coordination. They test, they flank, and they escalate in stages. If the test is not answered correctly, the next stage follows almost automatically. Johann located the feeding site, roughly half a mile from the fence line, and counted at least 6 animals. The constant whooping and giggling vocalizations went quiet the moment he arrived. That silence was a signal Johann recognized. He had heard it before from vehicles. He had never heard it while standing on foot, and from what I've studied, that distinction matters enormously. The animals were not ignoring him. They were assessing him. The nearest animal turned to face him fully, head low, shoulders raised. 2 others shifted to his sides without approaching. Johann took a slow step backward. The nearest animal took a step forward. He recognized the escalation and began backing away more deliberately. But what he misread was the animal that had circled wide through the brush and was now less than 15 feet behind him. That is the part of this story that I find most significant. Johann was reading the situation in front of him, tracking the animal facing him, monitoring the 2 that had flanked him. He was doing what an experienced guide would do, but the hyena behind him had moved through the brush without making a sound, and by the time Johann knew it was there, the distance was already gone. The bite came from behind, catching him across the back of his right thigh. He spun and struck the animal hard across the snout. It released and backed off, vocalizing loudly. The rest of the clan responded to the sound. The intimidation phase was over. Johann fought back. He was large and physically strong, but on the ground, outnumbered, without any deterrent, the situation deteriorated quickly. He sustained bites to both legs, his abdomen, and his right hand before a reserve patrol vehicle approached on a nearby track, and the animals scattered. The sound of the vehicle was enough. The hyenas moved into the brush and were gone. That speed of dispersal is something I think about in the context of what Johann had been trying to do. He had gone out there believing he could manage the situation on foot. A vehicle, just the sound of one, accomplished in seconds what he could not accomplish at all. The patrol team reached him within minutes. He was alive and conscious, telling them what had happened. The wounds to his abdomen were the most serious. He died en route to the reserve's medical post from blood loss, with the abdominal injuries identified as the primary factor. He had been conscious long enough to describe the encounter, which means he knew in those final minutes exactly what had happened and why. The reserve issued updated protocols prohibiting solo foot approaches to active predator feeding sites under any circumstances, regardless of experience level. Johann recognized the silence. It was July 9th, 2017, in the Denali region of interior Alaska. The midday temperature reached 71 degrees under partly cloudy skies. The terrain consisted of rolling tundra, dotted with willow thickets and scattered spruce trees, with a clear creek running through a shallow valley below the mining trail. Visibility was excellent, extending over a mile across the open landscape. Luke McKenzie was 30 years old, a recreational gold prospector from Colorado, who had traveled to Alaska for a 2-week mining expedition. He had purchased a small claim along a creek known for placer gold deposits and arrived 4 days earlier, hiking in with a heavy pack of equipment. Luke had prospected in Colorado and Montana for 6 years, but this was his first trip to Alaska. His camp sat on a gravel bar, 50 feet from the creek, with his mining equipment and sluice box positioned at the water's edge. The area was prime grizzly habitat, particularly in summer, when bears concentrated along waterways. While the creek was too small for salmon runs, it connected to larger waterways downstream and served as a travel corridor for bears moving between feeding areas. Before his trip, Luke had purchased an air horn, but had not invested in bear spray. His primary deterrent strategy was noise from his mining operation and periodic loud shouts to announce his presence. Interior Alaska grizzly bears are smaller than their coastal counterparts, with adult males typically weighing between 400 and 600 pounds. However, they are considered more aggressive due to increased competition for limited food resources. Creek corridors are particularly important travel routes and feeding areas, and bears will defend access to them aggressively. That afternoon, Luke was standing in the creek, bent over his sluice box, shoveling gravel into the upper section. The water ran at mid-calf depth against his waders. The sound of rocks tumbling through the sluice and splashing water filled his immediate environment. He had not looked up from his work in several minutes. The grizzly approached from upstream, walking along the creek bank. It was a large male, estimated at 480 pounds, with dark brown fur and a prominent shoulder hump. It had been traveling downstream along its regular route when it encountered Luke's camp and mining operation. The bear stopped 35 yards upstream and watched Luke work for roughly 20 seconds. The narrow creek channel and Luke's position created a confined situation. Luke did not see the bear and continued shoveling. The bear descended the bank into the creek and began walking downstream through the water. The confined space and Luke's proximity triggered a defensive response. It closed the distance to 20 yards before Luke sensed movement and looked up. Luke dropped his shovel. He had no bear spray, no weapon, nothing but his voice. He shouted at the bear and raised both arms above his head to appear larger. The air horn sat on the rock 10 feet away, useless and out of reach. The bear accelerated into a charge, water splashing as it covered the distance rapidly. Luke backed toward the creek bank, still facing the bear and shouting. When the bear was less than 15 feet away, he turned to run, but slipped on the wet rocks and fell forward into shallow water. The bear reached him as he attempted to stand, his legs scrambling for purchase on the slippery stones. The bear bit Luke's lower back, its jaws closing around his lumbar region. The bite caused severe spinal trauma and crushing injuries. Luke's legs went limp. The bear lifted him partially out of the water, shook him once, and threw him against the creek bank. Luke landed face down in shallow water. The bear bit his upper back and neck, teeth penetrating deep through muscle and bone. Luke's arms moved weakly in an attempt to protect his head. The bear then bit the back of his skull and neck, causing massive trauma. It held the bite for several seconds before releasing. The bear stepped back, stood over Luke briefly, then moved upstream and continued along the creek in its original direction of travel. It disappeared around a bend within minutes. Luke's body was found partially submerged at the bank's edge. His mining equipment remained in place, and the sluice box was still positioned in the water. The cause of death was severe spinal trauma from the initial bite, with contributing factors of massive head and neck injuries and hemorrhaging. No bear deterrent had been deployed. Investigators noted the victim had not been carrying bear spray, which had become increasingly recommended for anyone working alone in remote bear habitat. The case was ruled an accidental death resulting from a surprise defensive bear encounter in a confined space. It was January 14th, 2014, and the cramped chicken coop on the outskirts of Kampong Cham felt smaller than ever, the low ceiling forcing anyone inside to crouch while moving. That night, a massive Burmese python had already made its way into space, waiting for an opportunity to strike. Sokham Dara, 51, had spent decades building his small farm, raising chickens for both his family and extra income. He was a careful man, known for tending his birds meticulously. Lately, though, 6 chickens had gone missing, and Dara's frustration grew. He decided to stay overnight in the coop, hoping to catch the culprit. At first, Dara assumed the thief was a human. He imagined a neighbor or passerby sneaking in under cover of night to take his chickens, thinking about the footprints he might see or the shadows he might catch. I can picture him sitting there, crouched among the chickens, flashlight in hand, legs cramping, thinking he's ready for whatever comes, but not knowing what's really waiting. The coop was tiny, only 8 by 12 feet. Every corner was within reach, leaving little room to dodge anything large. Burmese pythons can reach 16 feet in length and weigh over 160 pounds. Their strength is terrifying. They can crush ribs and stop blood flow in minutes. In confined spaces, they use every surface for leverage. Dara probably thought he was in control, but the space gave the snake the upper hand. I keep thinking about how claustrophobic that must have felt. Walls so close that every move became a risk. Earlier signs should have warned him. Villagers had talked about increased python activity after the seasonal flooding, and a neighbor had found a large shed skin nearby. Chickens were acting stressed, squawking at night, huddling unnaturally. I can almost hear that frantic clucking echoing in my head, like a warning he didn't fully understand. Around midnight, the chickens erupted into chaos. Dara's flashlight illuminated the massive python coiled around one of his hens. Startled, he lunged to save. The bird slipped on the damp floor and fell directly into the snake's striking range. The serpent uncoiled and struck, wrapping firm coils around Dara's torso while pinning his left arm. The python wasn't immediately crushing him, but each struggle only made it tighten further. I hate imagining the helplessness, trying to push it away, feeling it adjust and brace itself, realizing nothing you do loosens its grip. Every movement gave the snake more leverage. Its muscles worked like a machine, tightening around Dara's chest and abdomen, then looping around his legs. The cramped coop meant he couldn't twist or get proper footing. Breathing became shallow, each gasp weak and muffled. I can feel the panic imagining it, pressure crushing your ribs, arms pinned, and the ground slippery beneath you. Within minutes, he lost consciousness as the pressure around his chest restricted breathing and circulation. The next morning, a neighbor noticed the unusual silence and discovered Dara's body still wrapped in the python's coils. Authorities arrived about 30 minutes later, finding the snake had moved to a corner but remained in the coop. The examination showed multiple rib fractures and internal injuries consistent with prolonged constriction and asphyxiation. He was later pronounced dead from complications of his injuries. The python was nearly 17 feet long and was later relocated by wildlife officials. After Dara's death, neighboring farmers reinforced their coops and improved safety measures. His family eventually sold the property and moved closer to town. The incident became a cautionary tale, though little concrete action was taken beyond the immediate village. I keep thinking about that moment in the coop, how tiny it was. Dara didn't expect a python that large, and the confined space made escape impossible. It's hard not to feel the situation could have been avoided if he hadn't gone in, alone that night. The signs were there, the risk obvious, but I guess sometimes pride and worry about your livelihood make you take chances you shouldn't. I can't say it was careless. It was human, but yeah, this one was preventable. It was June 14, 2016, in Sabi Sand Game Reserve, where dawn broke over the Lowveld and long shadows stretched across the bush. Somewhere in the thickets, a young male leopard had just secured a kill in a marula tree directly above ground that would soon seem harmless to anyone below. Tendai Mafukidze, 34, had spent 6 years designing water infrastructure in rural Mashonaland. Known among colleagues as quiet, precise, and deeply private, he rarely socialized, had no online presence, and lived a routine life centered on work and caring for his elderly mother in Harare. Tendai's 4-day safari at Nkombe Bush Camp was his first real vacation since university. He sought quiet observation in the bush and deliberately traveled with strangers, showing no history of risk-taking. I've seen cases like this in my research, and it really hits me how even the most careful, low-risk people can end up in danger when they step into the wild. The first 2 days passed uneventfully, with Tendai quietly watching wildlife under the guidance of experienced tracker Peter Viljoen, 43, who had noted increased leopard activity in the area. Leopards are ambush predators, relying on concealment and precision, and research shows attacks rarely give visible warning to untrained observers. On the morning of June 14th, the group stopped near a dry riverbed during a sunrise drive. Peter instructed guests to stay within 15 meters and remain visible. While others stretched or drank coffee, Tendai walked toward a cluster of bushes for privacy. Peter's attention shifted momentarily to another guest, leaving Tendai partially out of sight. Unseen above, a leopard rested on a marula branch, its impala killed beside it. As Tendai stepped behind the shrub, he unknowingly positioned himself directly beneath the predator, triggering a decisive, fatal strike. From what I've studied, this is exactly how ambush predators work. They wait patiently, and one small movement in the wrong spot can be all it takes. Tendai crouched, facing away from the tree. The light filtered through branches, masking movement above. The leopard adjusted its position, aligning its body with the target below. The distance was minimal, the angle direct. Without sound, it dropped. The impact forced Tendai to the ground instantly, the force knocking the air from his lungs before he could react. The leopard secured its bite at the back of his neck, compressing the airway and blood vessels in a single motion. His body reacted reflexively, hands clawing at the ground, legs kicking, but there was no time or leverage to resist. The attack was controlled, deliberate, and extremely fast. A nearby guest heard a brief choking sound and turned. Within seconds, the bushes shook, violently. Peter reacted immediately, grabbing his rifle and running toward the movement. By the time he reached Tendai, the leopard had already completed the critical phase of the attack. A warning shot caused it to release and retreat into the bush. Tendai was unresponsive when reached. Medical findings later confirmed that the compression of the neck had led to rapid unconsciousness and death within approximately a minute. He had been away from the vehicle for less than 3 minutes. The outcome usually happens in just a few seconds. There's almost no time to do anything once the animal attacks. Emergency services were contacted immediately, but by the time help arrived, there was nothing to be done. The incident was later classified as a wildlife fatality, with no indication of abnormal animal behavior. The leopard had acted on instinct, responding to proximity and opportunity. Prevention relies on multiple safety layers rather than a single action. Strict line-of-sight rules are essential, keeping all guests within immediate view of the vehicle. Rest stops in dense predator territory carry inherent risk, so some operators use only open, controlled areas. Guides scan both trees and ground level, but constant vigilance cannot guarantee detection. In this case, limiting movement entirely at the stop until a fully secure area was confirmed would have been the most effective measure. Tendai's body was returned to Harare for a small funeral. The incident drew little attention, and operations continued as usual, leaving behind a chain of ordinary decisions that combined to create a fatal outcome. It was September 8, 2014, and monsoon rains had turned Agusan Marsh in Mindanao's remote Agusan del Sur into a vast inland sea, pushing predators closer to homes. The stilted nipa huts sat like fragile islands, their bamboo foundations creaking under 3 feet of floodwater. Renato Dumigpe, 61, had spent his whole life on the edge of this marsh. He grew up helping his father with fish traps, then became a husband and father of 2, and, since his wife died of tuberculosis 7 years earlier, had lived alone in his single-room stilted house. Known as Tatay Ren in the barangay of 200 residents, he survived by selling tilapia and mudfish at the weekly market and growing rice during dry seasons. His daily routine rarely changed, checking fish traps at dawn, mending nets in the afternoon, and cooking simple meals over a clay stove at night. His small mongrel dog, tied to a post at the front of his house, was his only companion and his first warning against wildlife at night. Unknowingly, Renato had been feeding one of the marsh's most dangerous inhabitants by throwing fish scraps off the rear ramp. A massive saltwater crocodile had become habituated to the area directly behind his home. It blows me away that these crocodiles can grow over 14 to 17 feet and weigh more than 1,000 pounds, with enough bite force to crush large prey. The way they wait silently for hours makes them especially dangerous. Warnings had been building for days. Renato's dog barked at the rear of the house each night, which he shrugged off, while neighbors saw glowing eyes in the water and fresh slide marks along the banks. After several days of rain kept him from fishing, Renato cooked his remaining dried fish and ate near the back door, a simple bamboo panel held by a rope latch. He lay on his mat 6 feet away, unaware that rising floodwaters had turned the back ramp into a gentle slope directly connected to the marsh. When I read this, it really hits me how easy it is to not notice danger when you're used to things being a certain way. Everything seems normal until suddenly it's not, and by then, it's too late to do anything. Renato stepped onto the submerged rear ramp to rinse his hands, unaware how close the water now sat beneath him. The surface looked still until it suddenly erupted. A massive crocodile surged upward, clamping its jaws around his right thigh and knocking him off balance onto the slick bamboo. The force of the bite caused severe crushing injuries to his leg, and before he could react, the animal began a violent death roll. His body twisted with it, the ramp rattling beneath him as he tried to grab onto anything solid. He clawed at the bamboo, desperate to pull himself back, but the surface was wet and unstable. The crocodile's grip never loosened. With another powerful roll, it dragged him off the ramp and into the water. Submerged and disoriented, Renato struggled as the animal continued rolling, forcing him underwater again and again. Within seconds, his movements weakened. Within a minute of the initial strike, he lost consciousness as he was held beneath the surface. The crocodile dragged his body into the marsh, where the attack ended. Throughout it all, Renato's dog barked frantically from the front of the house, its alarm echoing across the flooded barangay. Seeing it described like this, I can't help but picture how chaotic and terrifying that moment must have been. The splashing, the sudden violence, and no way for him to get out. Neighbors were awakened by the barking and brief scream, but fear and darkness kept them from investigating. At first light, they paddled cautiously to his house, noticing disturbed water near the ramp and signs of a struggle. A clear drag trail led into the marsh, the reeds bent and broken along the path. Renato's body, recovered roughly 130 feet from his home later that day. Authorities responded quickly after the local leader alerted municipal officials. A wildlife team captured the 14-foot crocodile days later and relocated it to a sanctuary. Renato's funeral was held at the small community chapel, attended by about 60 people. His children dismantled the house where he had lived, leaving the site vacant as a somber reminder of the marsh's ancient predators. Looking at this case, it doesn't feel like a single mistake led to his death. It was a combination of factors: rising water, habituated wildlife, and isolation. From my perspective, it shows how living close to nature carries risks that build quietly over time, often in ways that aren't obvious until it's too late. Even people who know the environment as well as Renato did can be caught in situations where a few small changes create a fatal outcome. It was March 3rd, 2018, in the Northern Territory, Australia. The estuary outside Darwin was low and quiet at dusk, the tidal water dark and still, the last of the light sitting flat across the surface. It was the kind of place that looked calm because nothing was moving. That is not the same thing as safe. Liam Carter, 22, ran a wildlife content page on social media with around 3,400 followers. He had built it around a single recurring format he called Too Close. The premise was straightforward: find a dangerous animal, get as close as possible, film the reaction. He had approached a brown snake at close range. He had waded through floodwater in Kakadu National Park during wet season. Neither had ended badly. The format was working. His follower count had grown steadily with each upload, and the comments on his most recent videos were pushing him towards something bigger. Several followers had been asking when he was going to film a crocodile. One comment that appeared multiple times across his last 3 posts read, "Do a croc next." And look, this pattern comes up every single time in content creators' cases. The audience does not know they are part of the story. They are just asking for the next video. He had driven up to the Northern Territory with a friend. The two had made the trip together with the plan of filming new content over several days. His friend was there for most of it, helping carry equipment, watching from the bank, waiting while Liam got closer to things than most people would consider. He had been in the Northern Territory for 4 days when he identified the animal in the estuary. He posted about it that afternoon. The response was immediate. People wanted to see it. That unbroken record of walking away, combined with the pressure of an audience expecting the next escalation, was the most dangerous thing about him by the time he arrived at the water's edge. What gets me about that is how invisible that pressure is from the outside. His friend was standing on the bank watching. The audience was watching, and every single one of them had watched him walk away before. He had identified a large saltwater crocodile in the area through local reports and social media posts from other users in the region. The animal was estimated at around 13 feet. Saltwater crocodiles are the largest reptiles on Earth and among the most effective ambush predators alive. They do not chase or display before attacking. They wait. They can remain motionless for hours, fully submerged or barely visible at the waterline, and move when the calculation is right. They detect movement through pressure sensors along the jaw and through sensitivity to surface vibration, which means there is no safe angle of approach and no blind spot that reduces the risk of detection. The authorities had installed warning signs at multiple points along the estuary following prior fatalities in the area. Liam walked past them. He had watched online content suggesting that approaching a crocodile from a certain angle reduced the risk of detection. The same source had noted clearly that no angle made close proximity safe. Liam had taken the first part and left the second behind. He strapped his GoPro to his chest, set it recording, and waded into the water at dusk. His friend stayed on the bank. The water came to his knees. He moved slowly, keeping his profile low, angling toward the area where he believed the animal was resting. He kept moving forward. And this is the moment I find hardest to sit with, because at knee depth, in that light, with that animal already in the water, the outcome was already decided. Liam just did not know it yet. The crocodile did not move for approximately 11 seconds after Liam entered its range. Stillness is not disengagement. It is the final phase before a strike. The animal was already tracking him before the lunge began. The crocodile came forward from the waterline in a single explosive movement, covering the distance between them. Before Liam had processed what was happening, the jaws closed on his lower body with a force that made resistance impossible. The bite of a large saltwater crocodile can exceed 3,000 pounds of force per square inch. Bone and tissue gave way instantly. Liam was pulled off his feet and dragged below the surface in the same motion. What followed was the death roll. The crocodile rotated its body violently, spinning through the water with Liam locked in its jaws. The GoPro captured 11 seconds of footage before the water covered the lens. On the bank, his friend was screaming into his phone. I have thought about that friend a lot since I first read this case. He drove up there with Liam. He had been on every shoot. He watched it happen from the bank, and there was nothing he could do. That is something a person carries for the rest of their life. Emergency services were notified immediately by his friend on the bank. Authorities secured the area, but entry into the water was delayed until the crocodile could be located and conditions assessed as safe. Initial recovery efforts that evening were unsuccessful due to visibility and tidal movement. Search operations continued over the following days across the estuary system. Liam Carter's remains were recovered in multiple locations consistent with tidal dispersal. A formal medical examination was conducted following recovery. Clinical assessment determined the cause of death to be fatal injuries and drowning resulting from a saltwater crocodile attack. Wildlife authorities reviewed the incident and confirmed the behavior as a standard ambush predation response. Warning signage in the area was documented. The location was temporarily restricted during recovery operations. His final footage was retained by investigators and not released. His channel was later removed to prevent others from doing something like that. It was June 9, 2016, and the South Texas heat had settled over the scrubland outside Laredo like a weight that didn't lift, even as the afternoon stretched toward evening. The sky was pale and cloudless, the kind of day where shadows go flat and the air smells faintly of dust and dry grass. On a rural property set back from the main road, a chain-link enclosure sat behind a low outbuilding, its wooden support posts weathered from years of sun exposure. Victor Salinas, 42, had operated an unaccredited roadside animal exhibit on that property for several years. He wasn't a trained zoologist or a licensed facility operator. He was someone who had built something unconventional and kept building it, driven by a genuine fascination with animals that most people only ever see behind institutional glass. Texas law required registration with local authorities and liability insurance for dangerous wild animals, but enforcement varied heavily by county, and in the rural stretch outside Laredo, the paperwork existed somewhere between informal and non-existent. I don't say that to excuse what followed, but I think it matters for understanding how someone ends up in a situation like this. Passion and proximity are a combination that requires structure to be safe, and structure was something Victor's operation consistently lacked. The centerpiece of the property was an adult male African lion, weighing approximately 420 pounds. African lions are apex predators, built for explosive short-distance pursuit. They can accelerate to 50 miles per hour in seconds, and are capable of delivering a bite force exceeding 650 pounds per square inch, enough to crush bone without effort. What most people don't know is that lions are highly attuned to feeding schedules. In captivity, irregular timing doesn't make them calmer. It makes them more reactive, more alert to the moment food arrives, and more likely to respond to entry as a feeding trigger rather than a routine interaction. Victor's feeding times were inconsistent, sometimes delayed by hours. That inconsistency in an animal of this size and temperament was not a minor detail. No secondary containment barriers had been installed. Neighbors had raised concerns more than once about the fencing and the practice of entering the enclosure during feeding rather than using an external delivery system. Standard safety practices for large predator management are unambiguous on this point. Shared space feeding is not a procedure, it's a gamble. Victor had taken that gamble many times. On June 9th, the odds caught up. The afternoon had already run long. Feeding was delayed past its usual window, and Victor entered the enclosure carrying exposed raw meat, the same way he had done countless times before. I keep coming back to that phrase, the same way he had done countless times before. It appears in almost every one of these cases, and every time it means the same thing. The routine had become the risk. The lion advanced the moment Victor stepped through the gate, closing the distance before the food could be placed. The response was immediate and consistent with a feeding-triggered reaction in a large predator that had been waiting past its expected mealtime. Disturbed ground and drag marks near the entry point told the story of what followed. The attack happened fast, within a short distance of where Victor had entered, leaving almost no time between the gate closing and the moment everything changed. Nearby residents reported a brief animal disturbance, then silence. Victor was found later that evening by a family member. The lion was euthanized on site by responding authorities, and the property was shut down immediately. The incident prompted a local review of privately maintained exotic animal enclosures in the region, though the findings were largely informal. There's something about this case that I find particularly difficult to sit with. Victor had been doing this for years. The lion had never seriously injured anyone. And that history, I think, was exactly the problem. Every uneventful feeding made the next one feel safer than it was, until the one that wasn't. February 2nd, 2018, at Whitmore Station in far north Queensland, and the wet season heat had already broken 85 degrees before 7 in the morning when the sequence of decisions began that would leave paramedics focusing on the wrong thing. Bartholomew Bart Whitmore, 60, had operated the family cattle station in the Cardwell Shire for 31 years following his father's death. He was regarded in the local agricultural community as capable and direct, but also as someone who pushed seasonal workers hard and dismissed concerns from those he considered below his authority. The station ran lean and cycled through more casual labor than most comparable operations in the region. Based on what I've read, people said that he had a reputation not for cruelty, but for a total intolerance of what he called unnecessary hesitation. But I think they're just sugarcoating it. That morning, he had put a young backpacker named Jack to work clearing tall Mitchell grass along the eastern fence line, an area with dense patches of Mitchell grass, scrub, and rodent burrows known to attract taipans. Jack had no protective gear and no bush experience. After 40 minutes, he walked back to Bart and reported definite coastal taipan signs in the area. Shed skins, disturbed rodent burrows near fence posts, and partially hidden flattened grass patches, suggesting a snake had passed. He left the property shortly after. Simon Drew, a farmhand from the neighboring station, watched the exchange from across the boundary fence. The coastal taipan is one of the most venomous snakes in the world. Adults in far north Queensland commonly exceed 6 feet, with some over 7. Its presynaptic neurotoxin disrupts nerve-to-muscle communication, causing paralysis that becomes irreversible past a threshold. Severe bites can lead to respiratory failure in 30 to 90 minutes without antivenom. Strikes are fast, and the snake usually withdraws immediately, leaving only a sharp sting with no early warning of the venom's effect. Before Bart entered the grass, Simon called across and relayed what Jack had told him. Bart did not respond. He walked into the Mitchell grass, swinging the machete in low lateral arcs at knee height, precisely the opposite of the careful, high-stepping approach that anyone experienced in taipan country would use by instinct. Simon watched for a short time, then returned to his own work. The report said that he likely stepped on it. The post-mortem placed the bite on Bart's lower right calf, 2 puncture marks, 3/4 of an inch apart, consistent with a large adult taipan. The snake had likely struck and immediately withdrawn. Simon did not see the bite. What he saw, minutes later, was Bart walking quickly back toward the equipment shed, cursing audibly, moving with visible agitation. Bart apparently climbed into his truck and drove off down the internal station road. Simon assumed he had cut himself on the blade. He did not follow. The neurotoxins were already crossing into his neuromuscular junctions, silently dismantling the acetylcholine, signaling that kept his muscles responding to his brain's commands. In taipan envenomation, fine motor control deteriorates before gross motor function. Fingers first, then grip, then larger coordinated movement. His foot would have grown heavy on the accelerator, and steering increasingly awkward. Loss of coordination and mild slurred speech would have started within 15 to 20 minutes after the bite, with severe weakness by 30 minutes. According to eyewitnesses, the truck drifted from the internal road at under 20 miles per hour and struck a timber utility pole on the eastern boundary. The engine kept running. By the time the truck stopped, Bart was incapable of purposeful movement. Respiratory muscles were failing rapidly, but a few shallow breaths were still possible. Presynaptic neurotoxins, once they have disrupted the nerve terminals past a structural threshold, do not respond to antivenom. His chest muscles were failing. Each breath was likely shallower than the one before it. He slumped forward against the wheel. Maria Parada, a contract laborer driving toward the station on the adjacent access road, heard the collision and found Bart slumped against the wheel, minimally responsive. She called emergency services at 8:43 a.m. Paramedics arrived in 15 minutes and initially assessed him for crash injuries, suspected head trauma, possible chest impact. The bite on his calf was not identified until he was being moved for transport. I feel bad for the responders because they were faced with the problem they were not prepared for. They likely did things correctly, by the book, and yet they were missing the killer. The neurotoxin progression was already at a point generally considered irreversible for presynaptic paralysis. He was declared dead at 9:31 a.m. Post-mortem findings. Primary cause of death, envenomation by Oxyuranus scutellatus, coastal taipan. Secondary finding, blunt force trauma, consistent with vehicle collision. The cattle station itself was sold several months later. They changed ownership, and the new proprietors opted to restructure operations entirely. The seasonal and casual workers who had been employed under Bart were laid off, leaving many without immediate employment or housing arrangement. As much as Bart was to blame in the story, he still provided jobs for multiple people. I just wish he was kinder to them. Then maybe I'd feel bad for his demise. It was June 12, 2014, when the South African sun blazed over the sprawling private compound in the remote Northern Cape province. The 40-acre property sat isolated from the nearest town by miles of dusty roads and acacia-dotted landscape. Marcus Engel, 42, had built his dream here, a private exotic animal collection that included zebras, wildebeest, and his prized possession, a male African lion named Apollo. Marcus had made his fortune in the diamond trade before retiring early to pursue his passion for exotic animals. He purchased the 8-week-old lion cub from a controversial breeding facility 3 years earlier, bottle feeding it and raising it in his home before moving it to a custom-built enclosure on the property. His friends knew him as someone who pushed boundaries, often posting videos of himself playing with Apollo like an oversized house cat. The compound's main attraction was Apollo's 2-acre enclosure, surrounded by 12-foot chain-link fencing. Marcus had designed it himself, including a wooden platform where he would sit during feeding times. He entered the enclosure daily, believing his bond with Apollo transcended the animal's predatory nature. Local exotic animal owners had warned him repeatedly that socialization didn't eliminate instinct, but Marcus dismissed their concerns. On the morning of June 12th, Marcus noticed Apollo limping slightly after the lion had gotten into a brief scuffle with a zebra through the fence line the previous evening. The lion seemed agitated, pacing with his tail twitching, a sign Marcus failed to recognize as stress behavior. Despite this, Marcus decided to proceed with the afternoon feeding session, carrying a 30-pound haunch of beef into the enclosure. Adult male African lions weigh between 330 and 550 pounds, with massive shoulder muscles capable of taking down prey 5 times their size. Their canine teeth can reach 3 inches in length, designed to pierce through thick hide and crush windpipes. Lions can sprint at speeds up to 50 miles per hour in short bursts, and their bite force exceeds 650 pounds per square inch, strong enough to crack bone with a single clamp. Even lions raised in captivity retain their predatory instincts, which can activate instantly when the animal is injured, stressed, or perceives a threat during feeding. Marcus entered the enclosure through the double gate system, locking the outer gate behind him. Apollo watched from the far corner, his amber eyes tracking every movement. As Marcus approached the feeding platform, he made the fatal decision to examine Apollo's injured paw, setting the meat down and reaching toward the lion's leg. The attack came with explosive violence. Apollo's lips curled back before he lunged forward. The 450-pound lion closed the 15-foot distance in less than 2 seconds. Marcus had no time to react. Before the lion's front paws struck his chest and shoulders, each blow carrying over 400 pounds of force that instantly fractured his ribs and sternum. The impact knocked Marcus backward onto the hard-packed earth. Apollo's claws raked across his torso before the lion delivered his killing bite, clamping his massive jaws around Marcus's neck and shoulder. The canines penetrated deep, severing the carotid artery on the right side and puncturing the subclavian artery on the left. Apollo maintained his grip for approximately 20 seconds, crushing Marcus's trachea and cervical vertebrae, then began dragging Marcus toward the corner of the enclosure, instinctive behavior for securing a kill. Marcus's body went into immediate shock from the catastrophic blood loss. Within 90 seconds, his blood pressure dropped to critical levels. The combination of severed major arteries and a crushed airway proved fatal within 3 minutes. Apollo released Marcus's body and returned to the feeding platform, typical lion behavior once the perceived threat is neutralized. Marcus's property manager discovered the scene 2 hours later. Local wildlife authorities arrived and euthanized Apollo to safely recover the body. An investigation revealed that Marcus had no proper permits for housing a dangerous exotic animal, and his enclosure failed to meet even basic safety standards. The property was shut down, and the remaining animals were seized and relocated to accredited sanctuaries. It was the morning of July 29, 2017, along a narrow channel in the Okavango Delta in Botswana, where the water moved slowly between walls of papyrus and the air smelled of mud and reeds. The channel was quiet, the surface was still. Nothing visible suggested any danger. That stillness is part of what makes the Delta so disarming. Priya Sharma, 29, was a travel vlogger from Mumbai, India, with a growing YouTube channel focused on solo female travel. She had approximately 22,000 subscribers and was building a series on destinations in sub-Saharan Africa. She was organized and detail-oriented in her planning, but she had no experience with crocodile habitats and had not researched the specific risks of Mokoro travel in the Delta. That gap between general preparation and specific knowledge is something I come back to often in these cases. Priya had planned the trip carefully, booked a reputable guide, and done the work. But she had not understood what the Delta specifically required of her, and that specific gap was the one that mattered. Her guide was a local operator named Cabo Sithole, 44, who had been running Mokoro tours in the Delta for over a decade. Cabo gave the same briefing every morning. Stay seated, keep hands and arms inside the canoe. At all times, do not lean toward the water. He explained that Nile crocodiles in the Delta were not always visible and could approach from directly below the surface. Priya had been filming throughout the trip, holding her camera over the side of the Mokoro to capture low-angle footage. Cabo had corrected her twice on the first day. She adjusted briefly each time, then returned to the same position. This is the part of the story that I find genuinely difficult to understand. The warning had been given clearly, more than once, and the reason behind it was explained, and yet the habit continued. I think there is something about calm water that makes people feel safe in a way that open savanna does not, and that false sense of calm is exactly what makes crocodile habitats so consistently deadly. A lion on the plains is visible. Nile crocodiles are ambush predators that wait submerged with only their eyes and nostrils above the waterline, detecting movement through vibration in the water before striking upward with explosive speed. An adult Nile crocodile can reach 16 feet in length and weigh over 1,500 pounds, with a bite force among the strongest of any living animal. What makes them particularly lethal is not the initial strike, it is what comes after. On the morning of July 29th, Priya was filming a slow pan across the water surface, leaning forward with her camera extended over the side of the Mokoro. Cabo told her to sit back. She held up a hand and continued filming. The crocodile had been stationary beneath the surface, less than 30 feet from the canoe. The strike came from below. The animal lunged upward and seized her right arm just below the elbow, pulling her forward and partially out of the Mokoro. Cabo grabbed her left arm with both hands and pulled hard. For a moment there was a struggle, Priya partially in the water, Cabo pulling from one side, the crocodile from the other. He was fighting with everything he had. The crocodile began to roll. The torque broke Cabo's grip. Priya went into the water. Cabo used the paddle to strike the surface repeatedly, but the crocodile had already submerged with her. The channel went still within seconds. The same stillness that had been there all morning returned as if nothing had happened. A response team arrived approximately 2 hours later. Priya's camera was recovered, floating near the reeds. Her body was found the following morning, partially submerged beneath a root system roughly a quarter-mile downstream. Post-mortem findings confirmed death by drowning, with significant trauma to the right arm and shoulder. The medical examiner noted that drowning was the primary cause. She had been held underwater, not killed by the initial strike. Cabo was cleared of negligence. He had given the warning, repeated it, and when the moment came, he had held on until the physics of the situation took that option away from him. Priya's family was notified through the Indian consulate. Her final video, uploaded 2 days before the incident, showed her boarding the Mokoro at sunrise, describing the Delta as the most peaceful place she had ever been. She was not wrong about the beauty of it. She just did not know what was underneath it. It was August 22nd, 2016, in the backcountry of Glacier National Park, Montana. The campsite sat in a small clearing surrounded by subalpine fir and spruce trees, located several miles from the nearest trailhead. Elevation at the site was high enough that the air carried a crisp edge despite the warm day. Deether Hollis was 26 years old, employed as a seasonal ranger for his third summer. He had grown up in Montana, spending his childhood hiking and camping with his family across the state. He was 3 days into a scheduled backcountry rotation, living at remote campsites to maintain ranger presence in high-use areas during peak season. The rotation required rangers to spend 4 consecutive nights in the backcountry, answering hiker questions, monitoring campsite conditions, and providing emergency response if needed. The campsite had no recent reports of bear activity in the logbook. However, the area was known for grizzly habitat, and all backcountry sites carried inherent bear risk. Deether was the only person in this section of the wilderness that night. Glacier Park grizzly bears are part of the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem population. Adult males typically weigh between 400 and 700 pounds, with some individuals exceeding 800 pounds. These bears are highly intelligent, capable of learning and remembering locations where they have found food. They rely heavily on their sense of smell and hearing to navigate and hunt, particularly at night. Just before midnight, Deether woke to the sound of something moving outside his tent. The footsteps were heavy, deliberate, and circling at a distance of roughly 15 feet. He reached for his headlamp but did not turn it on, listening to assess the situation. The footsteps stopped near the tent door. He heard breathing, deep and steady, and identified it as a bear. He remained still, waiting to see if it would leave. The bear moved toward the food storage area and spent several minutes at the bear pole. The food bag remained secure. It returned to circling the tent, repeating this pattern twice more over the following quarter hour. The bear then made contact with the tent. The fabric pushed inward near the door. Deether sat up and shouted, a loud aggressive yell meant to scare the bear away. The bear stepped back, but did not leave. Deether grabbed his bear spray and unzipped the tent door partially. He shined his headlamp outward. The grizzly stood 11 feet away, a large male with a massive head and shoulders. Its eyes reflected the light. It did not retreat. Deether shouted again. The bear took 2 steps forward. Deether discharged the bear spray through the tent opening. The spray created a cloud between him and the bear. The capsaicin began to take effect, causing the bear visible irritation, but the animal's commitment to the situation overrode its discomfort. The bear pushed through the dissipating cloud. The bear hit the tent with full force, collapsing the structure and pinning Deether beneath the fabric and poles. The bear bit through the tent material, catching Deether's left leg just above the knee and crushing bone. Deether screamed and struck at the bear through the tent fabric. The bear dragged him roughly 30 feet into the tree line, pulling him free of the sleeping bag and tent material. The bear released his leg and bit his torso, jaws closing around his ribcage and fracturing multiple ribs. The bear shook its head violently, a motion typical of predatory feeding behavior. Deether's left arm struck the bear's face twice, weak blows that had no effect. The bear caught the arm in its jaws and bit through the forearm. The attack continued for several minutes. Each bite was deliberate and focused. Deether's movements became weaker as blood loss increased, his struggles diminishing until they stopped entirely. The final bites came to his neck and throat. The bear remained with the body for an unknown period. Evidence later suggested it had begun to feed minimally before scraping forest debris over the body, a caching behavior indicating intent to return. Deether failed to make his scheduled radio check-in the following morning. A search team was dispatched and reached his campsite that afternoon. They found the collapsed tent and drag marks leading into the trees. Deether's body was located roughly 90 feet from the tent site, partially covered with forest debris. The cause of death was blood loss from multiple bite wounds, with contributing factors of severe chest injuries and a severed brachial artery. The pattern of injuries was consistent with predatory behavior. Tracks indicated a single large male grizzly, estimated at over 500 pounds. Wildlife officials closed the entire northern zone and initiated an immediate search for the bear. The animal was located and killed 3 days later, 2 miles from the attack site. Genetic analysis confirmed it was the responsible bear. Examination showed the bear was in good physical condition with no signs of disease. The case was ruled a fatal predatory bear attack. The campsite was permanently closed following the incident. It was May 17, 2013, and the dense banana plantation across Costa Rica's Limon province had become a maze where hidden dangers lurked among towering stalks. One of Central America's deadliest snakes lay motionless in the undergrowth, waiting for a worker to pass too close. Mateo Rivas, 38, had 15 years on the plantations, moving faster than most through thick foliage. That morning, he aimed to finish early for extra overtime. His confidence in familiar terrain made him underestimate the danger waiting ahead, perfectly camouflaged. I keep thinking about how that familiarity probably blinded him to the predator lurking silently. The section Mateo worked was dense, with sunlight barely reaching the ground and fallen leaves hiding a massive fer de lance. Recent rain had pushed wildlife closer, and vipers had been spotted nearby. Warnings and signs of disturbed foliage should have made him cautious, but he moved efficiently, machete in hand, unaware of the predator just feet away. I can picture him stepping through the undergrowth, confident, yet blind to the danger ahead. The viper struck without warning. Mateo's left foot landed within striking distance, and the snake's fangs sank deep into his lower leg, injecting a massive dose of hemotoxic venom. The initial shock was probably confusing. He might have thought he had stepped on a thorn or broken branch, but within moments, the pain became unbearable. A burning, spreading agony that radiated up his leg. Swelling rose quickly, discoloration darkening the surrounding tissue, and a creeping sense of dread set in. I can't imagine the realization hitting him. The sharp, shocking understanding that this was no ordinary injury, that something lethal had pierced him, and there was nothing he could do to escape the consequences. Each heartbeat must have amplified the fear. Each second, a reminder of the venom coursing through his veins, systematically destroying tissue and attacking his very life. He tried to keep working, tried to push through, but the venom spread quickly. His legs swelled grotesquely, blood failed to clot, and tissue destruction began almost immediately. His heart raced, dizziness set in, and strength drained from his limbs. When his co-workers reached him, he was barely able to sit upright against a banana stalk. I can picture the panic in their eyes as they tried to carry him toward the road, knowing every moment counted, the hours stretching agonizingly as his body betrayed him. The journey to the clinic was brutal. Mateo's condition worsened with every step. Internal bleeding, shock, and organ strain left him barely conscious. By the time he arrived, massive envenomation and tissue destruction had overwhelmed him. Even with anti-venom and urgent care, it was too late. I keep imagining how powerless he must have felt, his body giving out with nothing able to stop it. The remote location and poor roads had made rapid help impossible. Doctors confirmed complete tissue necrosis, blood vessel damage, and systemic organ failure. I can't stop picturing that morning. The rustling banana leaves, the oppressive quiet after his last step. Afterward, the plantation increased safety training and protective equipment requirements, but nothing could bring Mateo back. His family received compensation, though it couldn't replace his presence or income. Among co-workers, the incident left a lasting impression. Workers now approached dense patches with caution, remembering how quickly a familiar landscape could turn lethal. The plantation, once just a place of routine labor, became a reminder that hidden dangers could lurk in even the most mundane corners of life. It's haunting to imagine how ordinary work turned deadly in an instant, and how quickly a place he knew so well became lethal. I keep replaying it in my mind. The calm, the quiet, and then that single bite changing everything forever. Even today, I think about the patterns of the leaves, the shadows along the ground, and how the snake's camouflage allowed it to remain undetected until it was too late. It's a stark reminder that confidence and experience can never replace caution when you're dealing with forces far stronger than yourself. One wrong step, one overlooked warning, and the consequences are irreversible. It was August 19, 2013, in Hwange National Park, Zimbabwe. The early morning sun glinted across the open savanna, and the Ngamo Plains stretched wide and dry. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of dust and distant waterholes. Oisin Gallagher, 44, an Irish geography teacher, had traveled alone to fulfill a lifelong dream of photographing African wildlife. Patient and methodical, he had joined a small safari group at Ivory Lodge and carried his prized Canon 7D with a 100 to 400 millimeter telephoto lens. Even I had planned trips for years and tried to be careful. Reading this makes me realize how a single moment can undo all that preparation. His guide, Tapiwa Moyo, 38, a professional with over a decade of Hwange experience, admired Oisin's discipline and noted his restraint around the animals. From research into safari incidents, I've learned that solo travelers who combine high enthusiasm for photography with large, unpredictable wildlife face situations where even small lapses can be deadly. That morning, the group came across a splinter herd of about 40 Cape buffalo, including several large bulls with fused bosses. Oisin photographed from the vehicle, noticing one massive old Daga boy standing apart, staring directly at the group. The bull appeared passive, moving with the herd, and this emboldened Oisin. Quietly, he opened the vehicle door on the far side and stepped out, crouching to frame a lower angle shot. He took 2 steps away from the vehicle to remove the wheel from his composition. Tapiwa noticed immediately and warned him to get back inside, but Oisin raised a hand and continued shooting. I think it's common sense that stepping out of the vehicle puts you at serious risk, no matter how experienced the guide is. The bull detected Oisin and reassessed the threat. Its ears flattened, tail lifted, and head swung back. In an instant, it charged. There was no hesitation. From what I've seen, it's easy to underestimate them, but those bulls don't bluff. They can charge incredibly fast, up to 56 kilometers per hour. Oisin had roughly 4 seconds from the moment he saw the bull to impact, a terrifyingly short window. The bull charged from behind, striking his lower back and left hip with the boss, hurling him against the side of the Land Cruiser. His camera flew from his hands, shattering on impact. The attack didn't stop there. The bull's right horn drove into Oisin's abdomen, tearing through muscle and puncturing his spleen. A second strike landed across his upper back and skull, fracturing vertebrae and causing catastrophic brain injury. The sheer speed and force of the assault left him with no chance to react. In less than 10 seconds, the entire encounter was over, leaving his body motionless and the injuries unsurvivable. Tapiwa radioed the lodge and authorities while checking for signs of life. Medical personnel arrived nearly an hour later and confirmed death at the scene. Emergency protocols were followed, but the speed and force of the attack left no chance for intervention. Oisin died from combined internal hemorrhage, spinal cord injury, and traumatic brain trauma. Research on large African herbivore attacks emphasizes that even seconds outside a vehicle can be fatal. Vehicles often remain the only barrier against charging bulls. The local wildlife authorities classified the death as a wildlife fatality, caused by exiting a vehicle in a restricted area. The buffalo were not harmed, and the guide was cleared of negligence, having followed standard protocols and warned the victim. Even I've been tempted to step out for a better shot, and Oisin's story reminds me how quickly one step can turn a controlled safari into a deadly moment. Staying inside the vehicle is the only reliable barrier. Once outside, the risk falls entirely on you. Guides can warn, but they can't stop a charging bull. His careful planning, undone by a brief lapse, shows just how fast wildlife encounters can become fatal. Oisin's memory card was recovered, preserving the final photographs of his lifelong dream. His body was repatriated to Ireland, and the funeral was attended by family, friends, and colleagues. His wife later donated his telephoto lens to a school photography club, keeping the memory card as a personal tribute. It was March 15, 2017, and the heavy pre-monsoon heat settled over the kampong houses outside Temerloh. The night air was still, and beyond the wooden walls, a large animal moved quietly through the brush, drawn by the presence of small prey and nearby human activity. Faisal bin Osman, 28, had moved into the small wooden house 2 years earlier after his workshop closed. Quiet and slight, he spent his days repairing bikes in a shed beside the house and lived mostly alone, calling his parents only once a month. The modest 1980s home had thin wooden walls, a simple layout, and small gaps beneath the doors and along the base, common in the area, but not always secure against wildlife. Unbeknownst to him, a large reticulated python had been frequenting the area, feeding on rodents and poultry around nearby homes. Over the months, warning signs had quietly accumulated. Faisal often heard rustling and scraping sounds outside at night, sometimes close to the walls. When he mentioned it to a neighbor, he brushed it off as stray animals or monitor lizards. A faint track in the dirt near his doorway appeared one morning, but went unnoticed. By February, a musky odor had begun to linger near the back of the house. Faisal assumed it came from damp wood or a dead animal nearby and tried to ignore it. Looking back, I can't help but feel how easy it is to normalize things in our own space. Little warning signs blend into everyday life until they're no longer just small annoyances. In the days before the incident, neighbors reported seeing a large snake moving near the edge of the settlement, likely following rodents and chickens. The pre-monsoon heat and limited prey pushed it closer to human structures. That night, Faisal lay on his thin mattress on the floor, the wooden door shut but not fully sealed, leaving a gap. Into the night, the python entered through that gap. I can't even imagine how quiet that moment must have been. No warning, no sound, just something massive already inside the room. Faisal was asleep when the snake moved across the floor and made contact. He woke suddenly, confused, and tried to pull away, but the python struck and anchored onto his upper arm and shoulder area. Almost instantly, its body snapped into coils around him. Faisal struggled instinctively, pushing against the dense, muscular coils, but the snake tightened with controlled, steady force. Its coils wrapped rapidly around his chest, torso, and legs, pinning his arm against his ribs almost immediately. The pressure compressed his chest and major blood vessels, disrupting circulation almost immediately. He managed one full, panicked scream, followed by shorter, strained cries that echoed in the small room. Panic surged as he realized he couldn't free himself. The python tightened rapidly, locking its coils in place and applying crushing pressure within seconds. I can't picture the panic he must have felt. One second he's asleep, the next he's completely trapped, with no space and no way out. Within seconds, his movements weakened as circulation was disrupted. His vision blurred, and he lost consciousness soon after, as his blood pressure collapsed under the sustained constriction. Even after he was still, the python remained coiled tightly, instinctively maintaining its hold. Its body stayed wrapped around him, unmoving except for subtle tightening, acting purely on instinct rather than intent. His neighbor, Enchik Hafiz, was awakened by the distant screams. He instructed his wife to stay inside, grabbed a flashlight, and cautiously approached Faisal's house, his pace slowing as the silence returned. Finding no response at the door, he stepped inside and immediately saw the scene: the disturbed room and the massive python coiled tightly around Faisal's motionless body. Shaken, he backed out and called emergency services. When responders arrived, they faced the difficult task of safely restraining and uncoiling the snake, which took over 20 minutes. Faisal was pronounced dead at the scene, and the python was captured and relocated to a nearby wildlife reserve. His devastated parents traveled from Terengganu for the funeral, attended by 25 family members. The house remained vacant for over a year before it was eventually demolished, a quiet reminder of what had happened inside. Reading this, it hits me how fragile our sense of safety can be. It was a quiet, ordinary night, and in just a few minutes, everything changed. The gaps in the house, the nearby wildlife, the ignored signs, they all built into a moment where there was no way out. It's a reminder of how quickly the familiar can turn dangerous when small risks are overlooked. It was April 12th, 2018, at a private animal facility in Crossville, Tennessee. Early evening, the light dropping, the property quiet except for the sounds of the animals. The facility sat on approximately 4 acres off a rural road and housed a number of large and exotic animals, including 2 Bengal tigers, a black bear, and several exotic birds. It was not a zoo. It was privately operated and open to visitors on a limited basis. Dylan Mercer, 31, had been keeping exotic animals for years before he started filming. He had developed his understanding of the animals through ownership and daily contact, not through formal training or professional certification. He knew the animals on his property the way someone who has lived with them for years knows them, through habit, pattern, and personal experience. That familiarity was real. It was also the basis of his confidence. And confidence built through familiarity without formal training has a particular kind of blind spot. And look, I want to be fair about this. Living with an animal for years is not nothing. That experience is real. The problem is that it can make you feel like you understand something that has never fully shown you what it is capable of. He started posting content about exotic animal care and handling. His early videos were advice-based: how to approach certain animals, how to read their behavior, what ownership actually looked like day to day. The tone was straightforward, and the knowledge felt firsthand. His following grew slowly. Then one video performed far beyond anything he had posted before. The comments and shares came quickly. He watched the numbers and understood what that meant. And this is the part that gets me, because I have covered cases like this before, and this moment, the moment one video blows up and resets your understanding of what your audience wants, is the moment everything changes. After that, the content shifted. Less advice, more demonstration, less explaining, more showing. He began documenting his direct interactions with the animals on the property, particularly the tigers. The closer the interaction, the stronger the response. Viewers kept coming back to see what he would do next. The channel had approximately 4,800 followers by April 2018. The facility operated under an exhibitor license. Recent inspections had noted minor citations related to facility compliance. One of the tigers, a 4-year-old male named Raja, appeared in his content regularly. Dylan referred to the animal in videos and on stream as his boy. He described Raja as manageable, as an animal that knew him, as something different from what people imagined when they thought of a tiger. Raja weighed approximately 420 to 480 pounds. What gets me about that description, his boy, is that Dylan genuinely meant it. He believed it, and that belief is exactly what made the enclosure feel like somewhere he could walk into. On a previous stream, Dylan had mentioned that Raja had not been fed that day as part of the facility's feeding schedule, noting a minor supply delay. At approximately 7:14 p.m. on April 12th, Dylan began a live broadcast from the facility. He moved around the property while the audience grew. By 7:31 p.m., the viewer count had increased steadily. He told the audience he was going to go in with Raja. He had done this on camera before. The audience had seen it. Some of them were there specifically because they expected it. And this is where it starts to get deeply uncomfortable. Because Raja had not been fed day. Dylan knew that. He entered the enclosure through the service gate, still holding his phone. Bengal tigers are large ambush predators. In the wild, they close distance on prey quickly and without warning, using explosive acceleration over short distances. The forelimb strike is the primary disabling mechanism. A single blow from a fully grown Bengal tiger is capable of breaking bone and immediately destabilizing an animal larger than a human. The bite that follows is positional and sustained. Dylan stepped inside. Raja hadn't been fed for roughly a day due to a supply delay, something Dylan knew. It wasn't long enough to make the animal desperate, but it was enough to put him out of routine. And it was already the time of evening Raja associated with feeding. Instead of waiting for that to be resolved, Dylan went in anyway, choosing to film while the animal was already keyed into that expectation. He entered the enclosure while waiting for the feed to arrive, the first. Contact was a forelimb strike, directed at the upper body. Dylan went down, the bite followed. Raja held the grip, repositioning once, in a way that wildlife professionals described as consistent with control behavior seen when large felids subdue prey. And this is the moment I find hardest to process. The audience watched it happen in real time. Several of them contacted emergency services during the stream. They were the ones who made the call. They reached the enclosure in minutes. First responders had already secured the area and isolated the animal before entry was possible. Dylan was located inside the enclosure, unresponsive. Paramedics initiated assessment immediately, but there were no signs of viable cardiac or respiratory function on arrival. Given the extent of traumatic injuries, resuscitation efforts were not initiated. He was pronounced dead at the scene at approximately 7:52 p.m. Clinical assessment determined the cause of death to be catastrophic traumatic injuries, consistent with a large felid attack, including blunt force impact and penetrating bite trauma. The facility was closed pending investigation. State authorities reviewed the incident and confirmed that the animal's behavior was consistent with a feeding response. Raja was euthanized the following day in accordance with safety protocol for large carnivore attacks. The exhibitor license was suspended during the review. Dylan's online accounts were taken offline shortly after. His family held a private service. One fact I can't deny is the animal did exactly what a hungry 400-pound tiger does when a person walks into its space at feeding time, and it paid for that with its life too. It was September 22, 2017, and a low overcast had settled over the outskirts of Tulsa, Oklahoma, the kind of gray midday sky that makes everything feel slightly muted. The temperature was mild, unremarkable, the sort of weather that doesn't stay in your memory. What happened inside a modified garage on a quiet suburban street that afternoon, however, is not the kind of thing that leaves easily. Melissa Grant, 29, lived alone in a home she had gradually adapted around the needs of her most unusual resident. She worked remotely, kept to herself, and by most accounts was thoughtful and organized. Someone who had researched primate care extensively before acquiring the animal and continued reading long after. She had obtained the chimpanzee years earlier, before Oklahoma began tightening its primate ownership laws following a series of high-profile incidents across the country. Under the older framework, private ownership existed in a regulatory gap that was wide enough to drive through without much friction. Melissa had done everything that was technically required of her at the time. That's part of what makes this so hard to categorize. The chimpanzee she kept was an adult male, weighing approximately 140 pounds. That number sounds manageable until you understand what it means in practice. Chimpanzees are not exotic pets in the way people sometimes imagine. Curious, trainable, manageable, with the right approach. Their upper body musculature is dense and fast twitch in ways that human anatomy simply isn't. Specialists in primate behavior are consistent and unambiguous. Private ownership of adult chimpanzees is not a question of whether a serious incident will occur, but when. The animal had already been showing signs of escalating territorial behavior, bending fixtures inside the enclosure, displacing objects during cleaning. Melissa had noted these changes. She hadn't altered her approach. I think she probably told herself she knew him well enough. That's a very human thing to believe, and it's almost never true with an animal like this. On the morning of September 22nd, she entered the enclosure for midday cleaning, removing food containers and replacing them with fresh supplies. It was a task she had performed hundreds of times. The attack began as items were being removed, a pattern consistent with territorial or possession-triggered responses documented in chimpanzee behavior research. Once initiated, the escalation was rapid. Impact marks on the interior walls and overturned containers indicated the violence of what unfolded in that confined space. A chimpanzee of that size, in a territorial state, in an enclosed room, there was no realistic path to escape. A neighbor reported several loud impacts from inside the structure, then silence. Authorities conducted a welfare check after failed contact attempts. The animal was sedated before anyone entered. Melissa was found inside the enclosure. Death was ruled accidental due to traumatic injuries. Local authorities informally tightened restrictions on primate ownership in the area following the incident, though formal legislation remained limited. I've read a lot about chimpanzee incidents in the course of putting these stories together, and the one thing that strikes me every time is how the warning signs are almost always present and almost always misread. Not ignored exactly, misread. Melissa saw the changes in the animal's behavior. She interpreted them as manageable. That gap between observation and action is where these tragedies tend to live. August 9th, 2015, and the dry season quiet of Kruger National Park's lower rest camp sat between the acacia trees like something waiting, kind of mourning, that should have kept everyone close to shade and off the perimeter paths. Conan Dlamini was 22, a second-year business administration student. He had grown up in Polokwane, the oldest of 3 siblings, and had visited Kruger once before on a school trip. What occupied him now was content. He had built a following of around 2,000 people online by filming himself reacting to things. This weekend trip with 4 university friends was a post-exam release, and Conan had brought his selfie stick with that implicit purpose in mind. Contrary to this incident, he was apparently not known as someone who took things too far. I read that his friends described him as someone who could read a situation. I guess he simply misjudged this one. The group had wandered toward the camp's quieter eastern perimeter when one of his friends spotted the snake under a marula tree and pointed. The ground along that stretch was dry and root-crossed, shadowed by mopane and marula, exact habitat for the black mamba. Adults reach between 7 and 9 feet and are among the most efficient, venomous snakes on the continent. Their venom is almost purely neurotoxic, progressively disabling nerve-to-muscle communication from the strike site inward until the respiratory muscles can no longer contract. Without antivenom, death from respiratory failure can occur in 20 to 60 minutes in severe cases, especially with neck or head bites, depending on venom load. A rope line between wooden posts marked the restricted boundary, with a bilingual warning sign fixed to the nearest tree. The group crossed it without discussion. Saifo Nkosi, one of Conan's friends, told a local reporter later that they had not read the sign carefully and assumed it was protecting vegetation. The snake was already in a raised posture, head lifted from its coil, when they came within range. That posture, in a mamba, means the animal has already registered a threat. Conan extended his selfie stick toward it, likely to get the angle he wanted. His friends were still laughing when the snake moved. The first strike hit his right forearm. The footage recovered from his phone shows only a frame blur, and then the snake already withdrawn. Conan shook his arm out and looked at the punctures, small and paired. He was still smiling when the second strike landed on the left side of his neck within 4 seconds of the first. Immediately recognizing something was wrong, Conan walked toward the nearby path, and his friends helped him. They began shouting for help and moving quickly toward the ranger station. He vomited once while walking, and his sweating became noticeable on his shirt. By the time they reached a point visible from the main camp road, his limbs were noticeably weak, his steps uneven, and he required support from 2 friends to continue. They flagged down a passing vehicle carrying maintenance staff, who radioed for a ranger pickup, but the camp's internal radio system was temporarily down, causing a brief delay. On the way, Venom progressed rapidly. His speech slurred, grip weakened, and his legs gave way multiple times, forcing the friends to lift him into the vehicle. Froth formed at the corners of his mouth. Breathing became shallow and effortful, but he remained conscious enough to track movement with his eyes. The rangers who eventually met them at the edge of the camp tried to administer oxygen, but it was already too late to reverse the neurotoxic progression. Conan lost the ability to breathe independently while being transferred in the ranger vehicle. He showed no distress on his face in the final minutes. That was the detail Saifo returned to in his interview. There was no expression that told them it was ending. Coroner findings showed 2 envenomation sites confirmed, right forearm and left lateral neck. The neck strike allowed rapid venom access near major vessels, accelerating systemic spread. Cause of death was respiratory paralysis, secondary to neurotoxic envenomation consistent with black mamba. Time of death estimated within 40 to 50 minutes of first strike, consistent with severe systemic progression of mamba venom. No antivenom was administered before death. The 3 friends who stayed with Conan were treated at the camp medical station for shock. Sifo gave a brief account to a local Limpopo newspaper the following week. What made this story sad for me is that he said the part that stayed with him was how ordinary it looked from the outside, that they were trying to help someone they knew, and then they weren't. The black mamba was located that evening and captured and safely relocated by trained park wildlife staff deeper into the reserve, following standard Kruger snake handling protocols. It was November 2nd, 2018, when the cool autumn evening settled over Gregor Vandermeer's sprawling property in rural Oregon, about 40 miles south of Portland. The converted barn that served as his reptile breeding facility hummed with heat lamps and climate control systems. Gregor, 45, had spent 2 decades building his reputation as one of the premier python breeders in the Pacific Northwest, specializing in reticulated pythons, the longest snake species on Earth. His operation was modest but profitable, selling juvenile pythons to collectors across the country. His pride and joy was a 20-foot female he had raised from a hatchling over 18 years, a snake he called Empress. She was the foundation of his entire breeding program, and he treated her with a reverence that bordered on obsession. Those who knew Gregor described him as meticulous and safety-conscious, except when it came to Empress. He had built her a dedicated room in the barn, 20 by 15 feet, with heated floors and climbing structures. Unlike his other snakes, Empress had free reign of her space. Gregor entered regularly to clean, conduct health checks, and feed her, always alone, dismissing the long-standing rule that giant constrictors should never be handled without a second person present. Fellow breeders had warned him repeatedly. Gregor insisted he knew Empress better than anyone. On the evening of November 2nd, Gregor prepared her weekly meal, a 15-pound thawed rabbit, and carried it into her room using tongs to keep the scent off his hands. Empress was coiled near her basking spot, her body forming loops nearly 18 inches in diameter. Her tongue flicked as she detected the food. Reticulated pythons are the longest snakes in the world, with large females reaching 20 feet or more and weighing between 150 and 200 pounds. They kill by constriction, not by crushing bones, as commonly believed, but by tightening with each exhale of their prey, preventing the lungs from re-expanding. Death typically follows within minutes, from cardiac arrest and asphyxiation combined. Multiple human fatalities from captive specimens are documented in the United States. Gregor placed the rabbit on the floor about 6 feet from Empress's head and stepped back. As he moved toward the door, his boot caught the edge of a water dish he had forgotten to move. He stumbled, and the sudden movement triggered Empress. She lunged, striking his thigh with her head. The impact knocked him off balance. He fell hard onto his side, and before he could scramble upright, her body was already moving around him. The first coil wrapped his chest and right arm, pinning it to his side. He tried to push free with his left arm, but a second coil came around his neck and upper chest. He tried to call out. The pressure on his lungs reduced it to a gasp. A third coil took his waist and legs. Empress tightened with every breath he gave up. His ribs began to fracture under the sustained pressure, first one, then several in rapid succession. At least one punctured his left lung, which collapsed. The coils around his neck compressed his carotid arteries. His vision darkened. His struggles weakened. Within roughly a minute to 90 seconds, he lost consciousness. Death came within minutes, from a combination of asphyxiation and cardiac arrest. He would not have been aware of it. Empress held her constriction for some time after he died, typical behavior, ensuring prey is fully still before releasing. She then began attempting to swallow him head first, working her jaws forward in the slow, methodical way large constrictors do. His shoulders proved too wide to continue. After an extended effort, she gave up and retreated to her basking spot. Gregor's business partner discovered the scene the following morning when Gregor failed to answer their scheduled call. Animal control officers, working with experienced reptile handlers, sedated Empress and removed her safely. The autopsy recorded multiple rib fractures, a collapsed lung, compression injury to the trachea, and cardiac arrest consistent with constriction. Empress was eventually relocated to a specialized reptile conservation facility, operating under protocols requiring multiple handlers for any interaction with large constrictors. The incident renewed debate across the reptile keeping community, and several states tightened ownership requirements in the years that followed. Gregor Vandermeer had known Empress longer than some of his colleagues had kept snakes at all. He had fed her, cleaned her space, monitored her health through 2 decades of seasons. None of it changed what she was or what she did when he fell.